The main threat to the Taliban is the economy, and it is time. It's that the hardship that the Afghans are going under right now will eventually make some of them want to stand up, or make some of them maybe want to take up arms or oppose the government.
3 years ago, the United States completed its controversial withdrawal from Afghanistan, ending nearly 2 decades of war. The swift collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban's takeover triggered a humanitarian crisis, raising questions about the value of America's long occupation.
You have a private sector that is just barely surviving, far from thriving.
So it's hard to readily say that life under the Taliban is better than it was as from life under Hamid Karzai or Ashraf Ghani.
The aftermath has seen a surge in refugees, a severe rollback of women's rights, and a resurgence of extremist groups.
So the Taliban have really made it worse in many ways because they've been issuing decree after decree.
Today, the region remains unstable, and key American concerns, from security to humanitarian issues, are in flux. Can the U.S. negotiate with the Taliban to address these challenges? And if so, at what cost?
All of this is going to take a long time. I mean, it's really hard to say.
Domestically, it's hard to see how we would go forward with a major effort with the Taliban.
It's the persistent problem of Afghanistan, getting this economy to function on its own without so much of international aid.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we're joined by Dr. Carter Malkasian and Masuda Sultan. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggart, president of Network 2020.
I'm very pleased to welcome back two people that have previously spoken with Network 2020. We have Dr. Carter Malkasian. He is an historian and the chair of the Defense Analysis Department at the Naval Postgraduate School and is a former advisor to American military commanders in Afghanistan. He has his doctorate in military history and also speaks Pashto. And I am also very pleased to welcome back Masuda Sultan. She is the CEO of Symbio Investment and has worked on Afghan issues for over 2 decades as a women's rights activist and as an entrepreneur bringing foreign investment, as well as an advisor to the Afghan government. So welcome back, both of you. I'd like to start where I usually like to start, which is with some scene setting. And Carter, could you please just kindly start us off with a broad overview of the political state of Afghanistan 3 years after the takeover of the Taliban? And could you also help us understand how the Taliban has transformed itself from this former governing guerrilla extremist group into a governing power of an entire country? And to what degree has this transformation been effective?
Yeah, absolutely, Courtney. And thank you for having me today. It's a real pleasure. And it's good to be able to speak to your audience again. So when we think about the broader situation in Afghanistan today and the Taliban's rule, I think one of the main questions that comes up to me is the Civil War over? Is the Civil War that started in 1979 and went for 40 years, has it finally ended? And when you look at the calm that exists in a lot of the country, that's not to say there isn't some suppression and oppression going on, and there are still terrorist attacks that happen. But if you look at the overall calm, it has to make you wonder: has that period of difficulty and hardship, has it ended? Now, we really can't say that it has quite yet, because we've had previous pauses in the civil war that was happening in Afghanistan, and you might say our early years when we were there were also a pause. But you have to wonder right now, is it more likely? So if you look at what the Taliban have done, they have been able to exert some kind of calm in the country. Part of that is the people were very tired. They were tired of war, and so we didn't see a new resistance movement start going, and we didn't see international support for another resistance movement get going. So part of it's that. A part of the other reason the Taliban are able to have this kind of order, perhaps for lack of a better term, is how they've structured themselves and how they've thought about themselves over the long period. We have to understand that this actually isn't the Taliban's first time governing. The Taliban did govern previously, and they would often talk about themselves, and when we met with them at various times, is no, we have a government, we know how to govern. We are the government in exile. So they think about themselves in that way. And the form of government that the Taliban had at the time, and appears to have today, is one in which there is a degree of centralization, in which the governors know that they're reporting upward, in which the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Interior know they're reporting to Haybatullah, the Emir. And there's an expectation that people are going to follow what Haybatullah has to say. And that degree of order and the lack of infighting stands a little bit in contrast to the government that we supported over time, when there was much more difficulty between the two sides. Why do the Taliban? Why is it that they're able to have this kind of coherence that exists? Well, for one thing, they remember the civil war in the 90s very well, and many of the people who are in charge today were around then. And they remember the anarchy that happened, and they remember how the other warlords, how they treated people, and how that resulted in great difficulties for the Afghan people. So that's left them with an understanding that if we start fighting with each other, things are going to get bad. If we go too far, if Sirajuddin Haqqani feels like I need to take too much power, if Mullah Omar's son, if Yaqub feels like he needs to take too much power, they understand that there's real negative repercussions for this. And in their history throughout our war, there were also times where there were friction that they managed to overcome with their transitions. So there's a history there. Part of it also, there was the kind of emphasis on Islam that they have, and the kind of student-teacher relationships that existed between these Taliban leaders over time. And those kind of relationships stress a certain kind of obedience, and bayat, the allegiance to the leader. And that is a little bit different between how the tribes run themselves, or even our government, the government that we supported, ran itself. So that creates a greater degree of cohesion with the Taliban. Now, as I say these things, I do recognize that there is conflict and friction within the Taliban. There are power struggles that go on. We know that within the different ministries that there are some people who are supporting Haybatullah. There are some people who are strictly in support of Sirajuddin. We've heard about various clashes that happen here and there. So we know that's there. I've heard other stories about there's various Taliban who are less educated, and they're upset because right now they can't be a district governor. They can't go and become a provincial governor. They're not going to get a government job, and so they're looking for money right now. So those are various issues that are there. When I think about the instability and the problems that happen in the countryside and elsewhere in Afghanistan, to me, it looks a lot more like the issues that are there are dealing. It's less that the Taliban are taking it out against former government members. Now, former government members are not going to be able to work in the new government. I think that's very clear. But it's less that they're trying to throw them in jail. They're trying to torture them or kill them or anything like that. It's more that within Afghanistan, every person who lives somewhere, every person who has a farm, every person who's in a village, they can have their own communal strife that's happening. They can have their own issues over land that are happening. So a major problem for the people who worked with us, I think, is perhaps less the government than it is their own neighbors in their own community who remember that these people work with the government, but now that government is out. Now the Taliban are in, and that gives room for competition to happen. And I don't want to talk too long. The last thing I think I'll talk about is the economy in time. So when we think about the Taliban and how long they could last in power if the civil war is truly over, the main threat to the Taliban is the economy, and it is time. It's that the hardship that the Afghans are going under right now will eventually make some of them want to stand up, or make some of them maybe want to take up arms or oppose the government. The drought that's been experienced there for several years is a dramatic issue for Afghanistan. It reduces the amount of crops that can be produced. The restriction on poppy is a dramatic action the Taliban have taken. It also speaks to their cohesion and orders and organization that they can affect that. But how long they'll be able to do that is a question. And the longer they press that, it is possible, I'm not saying it's for certain, it is possible that they will then have more internal issues there. And so the economy is an issue there. And I mentioned time there too, because it goes back to the memory of the Taliban leaders who experienced the civil war and experienced hardship. How long will that memory last? How long will that feeling last? Or will political competition take over? And those are kind of the threats I would see to the Taliban's political situation over the long term. So let me stop there.
That was great. Thank you. Really terrific introduction to the situation right now. Masuda, turning to you, and this actually, I think, picks up well where Carter left off. Looking at the situation of people in Afghanistan, we keep hearing about a massive humanitarian crisis, everything from food and water shortages, drought, to healthcare. So, to what degree is this a consequence of the war, just remnants of the war, and to what degree is it a consequence of ineffective Taliban governance? And based on your experience with humanitarian efforts, can either of these or any of the other causes be solved in the near future?
Thank you. Well, first of all, Courtney, it's great to be with you and again with Dr. Malkasian. It's difficult for a nation perpetually at war to prosper. I mean, Afghanistan was never really rich, but it's had 43 years of war with two global superpowers and brutal civil war. And as mentioned, potentially one that is not done. And I'll get into Taliban governance. The UN says that there's 23 million people, more than half the population of 40 million, who face food insecurity. So it's important to remember that before the collapse, donors were funding 80% of Afghanistan's budget, and that essentially stopped overnight, right? So that included security, education, and health, most public services, development funding. There's a total of around $8 billion a year, $8 billion a year. You can say this funding was a direct consequence of the war, so it was sort of a bubble. Afghanistan went into a shutdown mode as the focus was evacuations. So a lot of NGOs evacuated their staff or just stopped their activities. So the number of Afghans that were in need shot up and the economy at the same time crashed. So you had this snowball effect of the shock to the country, paralysis on the part of donors on which it relied, and then on top of it, already bad situation because what had been brewing prior, it was the aftermath of COVID. There was already increasing poverty due to conflict and mismanagement and corruption by the previous government. So that's what the Taliban inherited. To the credit of the US, when we rang the alarm bells about hunger and malnutrition, and we all saw the images of Afghan women lining up at the bakeries in the freezing cold just for a piece of bread, the US stepped in and funded the WFP in a big way and staved off a famine. But the funding has been decreasing over time, and I'll get more into that. And Afghans have been saying for years now that we don't just want humanitarian assistance. They want something sustainable. They want development assistance. They want jobs. And handouts are not the answer longer term. So the Taliban recognized this problem. Dr. Malkasian mentioned the economy as the big threat to the Taliban. It's the persistent problem of Afghanistan, is getting this economy to function on its own without so much of international aid. And the Taliban have been screaming at the top of their lungs about these issues, the banking issues, the chilling effects of the sanctions on the economy. They've been very focused on the economy. They've been building infrastructure projects like dams. They've even been encouraging women's business. But it's clear that they're unable to provide for the population without the help of the international community, and at least without the cutoff of the restrictions on the economy. So the Taliban have really made it worse in many ways because they've been issuing decree after decree, undermining women, their right to education, their right to work, and public life, banning women from working for the UN, going into the office for aid agencies, so they often have to work from home. Except for like health and some exceptions in education. And it's a big problem because 80% of the people in need are women and children, and it's getting increasingly difficult to get to them. So what the Taliban need to do is address this by engaging with the US and the EU, Western donors, to deal with this larger economic question. And then that's also tied into the human rights, women's rights, and political questions, the potential about a political settlement, in order to kind of get Afghanistan back into the international system, especially the international financial system. All of this is going to take a long time. I mean, it's really hard to say when this will start working again. And the question is somewhat connected to the other question about the emir. Many people say that the emir is unwilling to budge on some of these issues, and he's living in relative isolation in Kandahar. So to what extent we'll be able to make progress on that depends on the emir himself.
Thank you. That's a great segue into the next question for Carter, which is really how effective is engaging with the Taliban to accomplish even limited priorities? I mean, Masuda brought up the whole host of issues that really need to be resolved, but then there's ones that are of mutual interest, like curtailing ISIS-K. So based on your experience with the Taliban, what do we need to know about negotiations with them? And Masuda brought up the fact that the Emir is an important piece. And do other countries such as China have similar or different views on this?
So Masuda brought up a great point about Haybatullah. And Haybatullah is ruling in somewhat of a Mullah Omar fashion, where you don't see him very much. There are speeches that he's given and such that you can read and listen to. But he's kept himself in Kandahar, just like Mullah Omar did. And he runs himself from becoming a very religious stature. And in some ways, it's a little bit, it seems a little bit like Iran as well. But you also have to remember there's some key things about Haybatullah as well, is that he is someone who had supported the suicide bombing. He did issue fatwas, edicts that said that this was something that could be done. On his son, it's a little bit, I think it's I believe it is an adopted son, but his adopted son was a suicide bomber, or at least was publicized that way. So those are, pretty strong things to do that make one look all the more hard line on issues and makes negotiations difficult. Now, at this point, all our negotiations with the Taliban, at least that I think that we're all aware of, have not been via Haybatullah. They've been through the other members of the Taliban. And so that's how negotiations have moved forward. Now, talking more specifically about negotiations, I mean, I tend to think that there is value in having a relationship with the Taliban. I tend to think that having an embassy in a country is a good thing. Embassies help build understanding. Embassies help us, if there's a crisis, help us deal with the crisis. And I think that we suffer there's a lot of problems and friction you encounter when you don't have an embassy there. Also, I mean, humanitarian assistance, that seems to be a U.S. interest. It doesn't seem to have any reasons that we wouldn't want to provide that to Afghanistan, and you might even extend that into some economic interests. The very big issue here, however, it comes back to how we kind of think about the war and how we remember the war, and it comes to U.S. domestic politics, that it's hard to see which administration is going to decide that they want to engage in a major effort to talk to the Taliban. Opening an embassy will attract media attention. Large amounts of economic aid will attract congressional and media attention. It will reopen the wound of what happened in Afghanistan. It will open either side to being weak to the Taliban or weak against terrorism. It will open the Democrats to what happened in 2021. And I'm not trying to point any blame, but there will be people will make accusations on that. So domestically, it's hard to see how we would go forward with a major effort with the Taliban. Now, thinking a little bit more internationally beyond the United States, I think some things to think about when dealing with the Taliban. One thing is that I think an embassy, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, those are good things, but we should also understand we're not going to get much of a quid pro quo here. We've had enough engagement on the women's issue now for 3 years to have some skepticism about what we're going to get from the Taliban. On the terrorist issue, the Taliban have said for a long time, we're not going to let there be attacks out of Afghanistan on another country, but they've never said we're not going to, that we won't give some kind of comfort or allow some people to live in the country. They've never said that they're going to break ties with Al-Qaeda. And if they weren't going to break ties with Al-Qaeda when we had troops in the country, I think it's a safe bet. They're unlikely to do so. They're unlikely to budge now. They haven't budged much on an inclusive government, and allowing more people to come in, allowing civil society to come in, allowing people who are part of the former government to come back in. And like I mentioned before, that's not really part of their governing model. And I remember very specifically in negotiations with the Taliban, off to the sides, they'd say, hey, look, that was their time. Now it's going to be our time. When they were in charge, we weren't a part of it, and it's going to be our time, and they're not going to be a part of it. So I think we have good reasons there's benefits that can be gotten from engagement, but we just have to be very sober about there's benefits that can be gotten, but we have to realize that they only go to a certain point. There's only so much that we can get out of it. And the Taliban have some things that they want, they're not going to budge on, and we have limitations on how far we can get. And that's what makes engagement difficult. China and Russia, they definitely have a different viewpoint on this. They have greater reasons to engage with Afghanistan for economic reasons, plus Russia has political reasons and security reasons to be engaged with Afghanistan. And I would expect that each side could diverge on that in the future. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw certain countries saying, hey, we do want to recognize the Taliban, or we do want to, behind the scenes, have a greater relationship with them.
Are you looking to deepen your understanding of global affairs and connect with a community of engaged changemakers? Network 2020 offers a platform for professionals and aspiring leaders alike. Gain insider access to expert-led discussions on today's most pressing issues. Connect with policymakers, business leaders, and activists from around the globe. Cultivate the skills and knowledge to analyze and understand the complex global issues shaping headlines every day. Click on the link in the description to learn more and become a member today.
Do you see a scenario in which, over time, if the Taliban stays in place, assuming that it does, that greater international recognition would lead to some sort of bifurcation within the larger system of countries that would recognize the Taliban and ones that won't, or would that apply some pressure, do you think, to the United States?
I think in the near term it wouldn't apply. So yes, I could see that bifurcation happening. Although I would also think the more likely thing is that Russia and China will just work with them behind the scenes, and they'll avoid having the kind of issues in the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly that would be attached to recognizing the Taliban, and they'll just try to work agreements and provide assistance and money that doesn't require that kind of recognition. It could put that, them doing that could put some degree of pressure on the United States, but I think our domestic political concerns would outmatch that. So we'd probably just, bite our tongues and deal with it. Over time, it's harder to say. What would happen 10 years from now, 5 years from now is harder to say.
Thank you. Masuda, the Taliban rule obviously brought a lot of changes, labor laws, the security situation, and the banking system, among many others. So how has the financial situation changed since the Taliban came back to power? And how is the country really managing economically when it is cut off from much of the rest of the world?
And not so well. So I mentioned earlier that Afghanistan experienced this shock. It lost about 30% of GDP just in the first couple of years. And the problem is that when the Taliban came to power initially, this go around, you had a number of individuals under US and UN sanctions who came into control, including, for example, like in the central bank, even though the law of the central bank itself hasn't changed. But the freezing of the central bank assets, the freezing of the private bank's assets meant that people's lives were turned upside down. And the country is still largely cut off from the international financial system. Although it's something that the U.S. Treasury has attempted to address with something called the General License Number 20, meaning that it's technically possible to do humanitarian aid transactions and even trade. And even, for example, paying customs duties to the Taliban is allowed. But practically, there's still a big problem in banking, and some of the largest NGOs are still having trouble making transfers for things like paying employees, et cetera, really for important life-saving work. Most of the banks are unwilling to engage in these transfers involving Afghanistan. They will claim Afghanistan is under sanctions, even though Afghanistan is not technically under sanctions, but they're unwilling to take the legal risks. And then there's also the reputational risk of dealing with what is essentially a pariah state. Taliban macroeconomic management has surprisingly been better than expected. For example, they've managed to stabilize the exchange rate. Inflation is under control. They're pretty good at revenue collection, and there's rising exports. But there's still little hope that there'll be, for example, FDI coming in, even with the improved security. There's little hope that the economy will grow or even keep pace with population growth. you have a private sector that is just barely surviving, far from thriving. As the Taliban have been attempting to raise revenues, they've been squeezing an already shrinking base of the private sector. And so people have been closing down their businesses. The jobs have been lost. And so there's not a lot of hope for the private sector that things will get better. But for example, the Afghan American Chamber of Commerce did conduct a visit to Afghanistan almost a year ago, and there are other trips. People are trying to help, but it's very, very difficult given the political status of the country and the disconnection from the international community.
As a quick follow-up, are there areas of the economy that seem to be able to get a little bit more traction than others?
Yeah, so agriculture is growing. Agricultural exports are growing, which is very good. There have been a lot of problems at the border with Pakistan. There's been a lot of shutdowns when it's time to sort of export during spring, the agricultural products. So it's been really hard on farmers, but generally that's been one kind of relative bright spot.
Great, thank you. Carter, kind of a big picture question. After 2 decades of war and then the 3 subsequent years of Taliban rule, what do you think the legacy of these years are and will be? And what needs to be done to reconcile all that those years brought with it, from the bad to the good, with where we are today? I mean, it feels like Afghanistan has fallen off, at least in the US, just the collective attention. And I wonder if there's a risk with that.
So I'd say that what we're kind of going through in the U.S., at least, is an enforced exercise in forgetting. I think that people don't want to remember how the war ended. As we were talking right before this started, the war was often forgotten while it was actually being waged as well. But it is a war that we were involved in, that the international community and the Afghans were involved in for 20, if not 40 years. It was a war that we were involved in for over 20 years. It was a war in which thousands of Americans lost their lives in, and more than that were wounded. So it is something that we shouldn't readily forget. And as important as Ukraine and Gaza is right now, the Afghan experience is its own experience. And having spent time on the ground there in places, I do have a certain feeling that when U.S. troops are engaged on the ground, that is something that we don't want to forget what happened there. We don't want to forget what that experience was. So when I think about how we remember the war, I think there's 3 things I'd like to call out in terms of how we remember it. And perhaps the most important is that, for most of the time we were there, whether we were misguided or not, we really believed there was a terrorist threat. Our leadership believed that there was a terrorist threat. The soldiers on the ground who were engaged, they believed that there was a terrorist threat. We were looking carefully for, where was Al-Qaeda, what Taliban connections there were to Al-Qaeda at the time. And given the recent attacks at the time that it happened in the United States, there was a feeling you just couldn't let that go, that you had a responsibility to the people, to the American people, to be taking care of this problem. And I mean, there was an actual threat. I'm not saying it wasn't overblown and that it really lasted as long as we stayed there, but for a time there was. And I think that's why a whole lot of people who were there, and they were trying to, but protect Americans, protect Western Europeans, protect the rest of the world. And that should be remembered. We should also remember that there was a real improvement for Afghans in certain respects when we were there. There was an improvement in health. There was an improvement in education. As Masuda just talked about, there was an improvement in the economy. There was an improvement in women's rights. Even things that we think that weren't managed well, like roads and such, like the ring road around Afghanistan, it's hard to think of a better way to get people to healthcare. And whether the road lasted well, whether it had potholes in it 5 years afterwards, it still improved the lives of a whole lot of Afghans who were there. Now, the other thing we have to think about, though, I think, is we remember the war, that the war did go on for a long time, and it was a civil war, and it did harm a lot of people in that. So, we're there to protect ourselves against a terrorist threat. You have to weigh that against what harm may have come to the rest of the Afghans. And that particular part of the legacy, we don't have a great answer to right now, because just as Masood is going over, you can see that while there might be safety for more people, there is also hardship going on right now for the Afghans. So it's hard to readily say that life under the Taliban is better than it was as from life under Hamid Karzai or Ashraf Ghani. But we have to keep in mind that our presence there did bring conflict. Our presence there brought a resistance to occupation. Our presence inspired people to fight. So for the people whose lives were improved in health and education and women's rights, there's other people who lost their lives, either because of our bombs going in the wrong direction, an IED in the wrong place, or just simply the violence that happens with civil war. And that's something that as we look at other conflicts we're going to be in, other times when we're worried about our national interests, that you should weigh the national interest against what can be happening to the people in there, in those places. So, those are some of the things that I think about when we talk about how we remember the war, how we remember it now 3 years out, and hopefully how we continue to remember it over time.
Thank you. Masouda, you've worked for decades in a number of different capacities as a humanitarian advocate for the Afghan people, particularly women. Now that the Taliban has cemented control over the country, what can such advocates do to help the situation of Afghan women, if they're so inclined? And how does one balance the issue of human rights with the need for humanitarian relief? And sort of the final in this constellation of questions, is going around the Taliban directly to the Afghan people possible?
Well, I think Dr. Malkasian pointed to something really, really important, which is that the U.S. Essentially funded and managed, along with the Afghan people, this huge improvement in the health and education of Afghan women and Afghan people. I mean, that is, I think, for all of the misery that the U.S. gets for that war. I think if we look at the brightest spot of our intervention, it is clearly on the issue of Afghan girls' education and the improvements in health, and that's something we should remind people about, and it's something we should continue to work on. Because the other side of that, as mentioned, was that a lot of people had to die because of this war. And we always said that the war wasn't against the Afghan people, that we didn't have a problem with the Afghan people. And so I think continuing the legacy that we have built, we got women's literacy to 25%, which was more than doubling of what it was before. And it's still at one of the lowest in the region, don't get me wrong, but continuing to invest in that kind of thing for a very low cost, mind you. The war cost us $50 billion a year. We're now spending $1 billion a year, and that's already being cut. There are people in Washington saying, why should we fund Afghanistan, for example? There's other people saying that, well, this money is going to the Taliban, as if all of this aid money is going directly to the pocket of the Taliban, even though it's going to the WFP, to UNICEF, and to other very important programs. So Afghanistan is at risk of being sort of attacked on the one side, the Afghan people attacked on the one side by having, I say attacked, but what I mean is their aid cut off, right? And that's their lifeline. So there are people actively working to cut that off. And on the other side, they have the Taliban, who are, with Afghan women, restricting them in all of these huge ways. I mean, it's considered, Human Rights Watch calls it the largest human rights crisis in the world. So Afghan women are sort of stuck between these two. There's just today, there's been 10 international NGOs like Save the Children and others who have rung the alarm bell, saying that the reduction in funding is really a problem. Donors seem to want to turn their back on Afghanistan for many reasons, but they're now saying that because of the Taliban's restrictions and their moral objection to the way women are being treated, that they're going to cut off these aid programs. But the reality is that they're just punishing Afghan women by cutting off these programs, and that it's still possible to get aid to Afghan women. There are so many programs run, especially with smaller NGOs. I work with one, for example. We do food drops to women who are former survivors of domestic violence or currently dealing with domestic violence. We run safe circles. Some of them are run online or through mobile phones so that they have a place to interact with other women, because a lot of them are restricted to being at home because they can't meet publicly. They used to meet in the office, in the NGO office, but they're no longer allowed to do that. So there are still ways to get to Afghan women. The other thing to remember is, for example, at the primary education level, there's still millions of girls in school. So we could potentially be working at that level. There are programs working at the higher levels as well. For example, online university. I was just speaking with someone yesterday who said he enrolled his daughter in an online university in Kabul. So those kinds of things are possible and should continue. What we should not do is isolate the Afghan population, because that is how we will get a repeat of what happened in the 1990s. And we've been trying to ring the alarm bell on this, which is even if we're frustrated with Afghanistan, even if we don't like talking to the Taliban, even if we feel like it's not accomplishing the things that we want to accomplish, this is a long-term exercise, this country. We don't want to repeat the same mistakes of the 1990s. We don't want to turn our back and then find out that something has happened that is affecting us. We need to keep a relationship with these people. We need to keep a relationship with this country. And as Dr. Malkasian said, I also agree with him that, we should reopen our embassy in Afghanistan. We should have a presence there for our own interests as well as for the interests of the Afghan people. But in terms of U.S. interests, the thing to do is to not repeat the isolation of the country that we had in the 1990s.
Thank you. One final question for both of you. I'll keep it quick. The theme that seems to be emerging is this idea of we can't go back to the 1990s and we can't keep Afghanistan isolated, and keeping in mind that there are millions of people whose lives are in that in this situation. What is the one thing that you would most want to see now to feel like things are moving in a positive direction, that we won't be going back to the 1990s? So I'll start with you, Carter, and then you, Masuda.
I think there's two things that are positive. One is that we're not going back to the 1990s would be a degree of continued stability in Afghanistan and something done to make sure the economy doesn't go horribly wrong. One of the great challenges that the Taliban are going to have over time is, like I mentioned, time, economy being challenges for them. Well, are they going to be able to adapt to that? Because authoritarian regimes have trouble adapting to it. If they reform too quickly, things fall apart and you get back to an anarchic kind of environment. If you don't reform, then things will also collapse upon you because you won't be able to sustain the economics of it. But also the other thing that always comes back, and perhaps it's just my time in government and affairs like this, is the terrorist issue, and where that's going to be in the future. So it's 3 years since the fall, and if you remember some of the assessments we heard in Congress and such around 2020, 2021, 2020, 2021, was that right now, if the predictions that were being made was that we won't know for 3 years after departure if these terrorist groups have regained capability. The assessment was going to take them 3 years to regain capabilities to be able to do something outside of Afghanistan. And that was the timeline that thought was necessary for them to provide a threat. So right now, you look at things, and on the one hand, I think you'd say, well, it looks like we're doing okay. We don't hear as much from Afghanistan on this. There is a problem with ISKP. Al-Qaeda is not totally gone, but threats are drastically reduced. On the other hand, we might say it's hard to say because we don't know as much as we used to know. We don't have information like we used to have. We don't have as many journalists on the ground as we used to have. We're not receiving all this information to have an idea of what the threat is. And then you might point to the attack on Zawahiri, the continued Pakistani Taliban existence in Afghanistan, ISKP's existence, as reasons for us to be concerned. And like I mentioned, we do know that the Taliban haven't actually broken with groups. And you put that into a larger context of what's happening in Gaza, that you might say that, well, could that spark something? Could that create a greater terrorist threat? And Sergeant Helkani did mention Gaza. Did mention the Palestinians in his speech. So that's a little bit of an unknown about the future. And to be most comfortable in Afghanistan, to get to your point, would be that we don't see any continuation of terrorist attacks there, because I think that is what we want. Regardless of how this war ended, we're all going to be better off if there is not a resumption of terrorism coming from Afghanistan, whether that's under whoever's rule that is. But I think that's been the question for the past 3 years. I think we're a little bit more comfortable with it now, but I think it's going to continue to be a question for the next 3 years.
Thank you. And Masuda, your thoughts.
We should not forget Afghanistan like we did in the 1990s. We should not repeat that mistake. We should stay engaged with the Afghan population and with their rulers in order to have the best outcome for ourselves and for them.
Well, with that, thank you both. Fascinating conversation. Such great insight from the two of you. A great pleasure to be with you as always. Really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. Voiceover host and editor for this episode is Casey Craig, with production support from Liam Austin and Brian Thong. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.